I knew about Christian mysticism, I knew about Western spiritualities, but nothing really about the deep tradition that there is in Islam. It wasn't even poetic, it was something else. It was a kind of visionary, you could tell it was a visionary experience, but somehow it made a big impact on me. I had no idea what it was talking about. But I thought, very interesting, I've not read anything like it. What has become obvious to me is the immense need for Ibn Arabi's teaching to be available to people. So most of my work today is to do with making it as available as possible. This is a man whose genius is, for me, unsurpassed in any language, anywhere in the world. And my great surprise really is always that he's so little known in the West. The name Ibn Arabi does not come to people's lips in the way that, let's say, William Shakespeare does. You have, as an Arab, you have a particular, you've been brought up in a tradition with a particular view of Ibn Arabi. But don't forget, Ibn Arabi was born in Spain. He was born in the West. The vision that he had of his poetry, where an extraordinary creature that came out of his mouth and its head extended to the east and to the west. And then he said, when I came back to myself, I realized that my words would reach the east and the west. So all the representations of circumambulation of the Kaaba as a psychological or spiritual equivalent within us. Let's say, we can say that our thoughts, our consciousness is circling about something we cannot name even. Now, for many people, they think they know what I is. They think they know their own identity. As you probably know, in his own life, he describes an extraordinary event when he goes to the Kaaba and he starts reciting a poem in praise, actually it's in praise of the human being as being superior to the Kaaba, and the Kaaba gets angry with him and raises her skirts and as if to attack him. And he has to, the way he puts it is he has to recount 8 love letters to calm her down. Well, why 8, you would say? Yes, and also the whole world is a tajalli. And therefore you're not separated. There's nowhere to, where are you going to run from and to? He is the one you run from, and he is the one you run to. As you know, there's a famous tradition of the Prophet. I smell the nafas ar-Rahman coming to me from the Yemen. So as you know, the breeze that comes from the Yemen is a sweet, gentle, beautiful breeze, let's call it. And the representative of all those qualities in himself is Jesus. There are treatises written about the meaning of this istilam, which is, you know, the kissing, and how important it is. So from one point of view, we see it as the Kaaba itself. From another point of view, we see it as part of the Kaaba. As part of the Kaaba, it is one part of the tawaf. As kissing it means now that you are, how can you say, you are coming as close as possible to the darkness of this place. What is being represented externally is something that is a complete reality internally for the person who is awake. Each support or corner, let's say, is under the jurisdiction of a prophetic figure, prophetic reality. Let's say the spiritual reality of these prophets is not necessarily what people imagine them to be. not necessarily at all. That's what Khidr's role in the world is. To bring people to the place where there's no distance between their consciousness and their reality. So the stories of him and Moses, for example, are to do with this apparent divide between the Zahir and the Batin, which from the standpoint of Khidr actually it doesn't exist, that we were never apart from the presence. What we call absence and presence is from our point of view because we are still in separation. I think this is a tremendous training in accepting other points of view to your own as valid, interesting, revealing, and something to be cherished, not to be opposed. It's a kind of teslim that he talks about, where we become like ground and we accept our servanthood absolutely and totally, just like the bottom of the Kaaba sits securely on the ground. So that means that the perfect human being is the final resume of all the other degrees of existence, just as the letter Waw is the final letter that can be articulated. So you can see now its association with 6 is very important. That means that the Kaaba itself is equally a representation of the perfect human being. We don't allow the variety to actually manifest itself. So that relates directly to the meaning of qalb. And in one of his prayers, he asks, give me a qalb. Because it's actually a gift. We have this potentially in us, but we have to awaken this qalb, which is qabil. Because we think of ourselves a certain way, we therefore limit our capacity to receive. But we don't realize that the reality of life at each moment is that we have the capacity to receive the next moment completely. The work is not in becoming receptive. The work is in removing what is preventing you from being receptive. You're not a colored receptacle. You're not a receptacle. You are nothing. When we talk about servanthood, ubudiyya, we do not mean that the servant exists. We simply mean that they are the place of manifestation of the Lord. That's what they are. Is the reality of fana, but the reality of fana is also baqa. It's not even to talk about as two sides of the same coin is not really quite right. They're the same thing. The story of Ibn Arabi shows us exactly the same thing as the Prophet doing the tawaf. Why? What? If he is the Prophet and he is the exemplar, why does he need to do it? Because it shows us something about how to be a real human being at the same time. So following the model of the Prophet is one of the most important elements in the whole. And they say, which one is better? Is Ghazali better than Ibn Arabi or Ibn Arabi better than Ghazali? Or Mullah Sadra. Is Mullah Sadra better than Ibn Arabi because he came later and he explained more, or is Ibn Arabi better? So on and so on. All these kind of discussions are like, sort of on a historical story level of who's got the biggest understanding.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. In this interview, we are interviewing Professor Stephen Hertenston from the United Kingdom and from Oxford. He has been editor of the Journal of the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society since 1982 and is a co-founder of Anqa Publishing. He is interested in Ibn Arabi studies, and he has also participated and gave talks on Ibn Arabi thought at conferences across the world. He's the author of several books such as The Unlimited Mercifier, The Spiritual Life and Thought of Ibn Arabi, and books which are translations of Ibn Arabi's thought such as The Four Pillars of Spiritual Transformation, The Alchemy of Human Happiness, The 7 Days of the Heart. So, Assalamu alaikum, welcome Doctor, it's an honor having you with us today.
Thank you very much. Wa alaikum salam.
So, in the beginning, tell us more about yourself, your academic and spiritual journey in life, your special interest and dedication to Ibn Arabi studies, and what's so fascinating and attracting in Ibn Arabi, where you spend hours, days, months, and years trying to discover different aspects of his thoughts and theories.
Such a question, Hadi. Such a question. So, I suppose if I look back at the beginning of things, like many things, you think, well, it started then, and then you look back a little bit further and you think, oh, it started then. So the main interest that I had in Ibn Arabi came from when I was at university in Cambridge, and I was studying history. So I was trained as a historian. And part of the course was that we should go beyond English history, European history. So for the last year of the course, we were allowed to do world history, as it was called. So one of the courses was in African history. So I got particularly interested in North Africa because my grandfather actually originated from Algeria. And so I wanted to find out a little bit more, and I started to come across references to Sufism, about which I'd heard nothing. Nothing in my reading anywhere had ever mentioned even the word. Then there were starting, this was in the late 60s, there were starting to be books produced that mentioned the Sufis. For example, Idris Shah wrote a book called The Sufis. Then there were other things put together primarily by Idris Shah. Started to think, well, this is interesting. And also, why have I never heard anything about it? When I was studying African history, we started to read about the Tijaniya. So I thought, sounds very interesting. So I tried to find a book in English on Sufism. At that time, in the late 60s, 1970, there was almost nothing, except for if you were in an Arabic department, you might have come across one or two things. But I did manage to find a book called Sufism, I think it was called, by Reynold Nicholson, who was as you probably know, the first translator of Ibn Arabi in English. He taught in Cambridge many, many years before. And he'd actually been the translator of Ibn Arabi's Turjمان الأشواق. So this book was in English. It was a general overview of Sufism. And the more I read, the more I thought, you know, I'm really very, very surprised that nobody ever told me about anything like this. I knew about Christian mysticism, I knew about Western spiritualities, but nothing really about the deep tradition that there is in Islam. So I started to read, and there were two things which to this day I remember the impact that they had on me. The first was an extract that he translated from Nifari's Mawaqif. Now, when I read it, it was all about the ocean and planks and bits of wood sinking, and it was so psychedelic for somebody brought up in the West I couldn't believe it. It wasn't even poetic. It was something else. It was a kind of visionary, you could tell it was a visionary experience, but somehow it made a big impact on me. I had no idea what it was talking about. But I thought, very interesting. I've not read anything like it. So a few pages further on, I came across the famous poem of Ibn Arabi's, "My heart has become capable of all forms." And I read this poem and immediately had a kind of immediate understanding, let's say here, in the heart, and intellectually, I didn't understand it at all. And I thought this was really the first experience I'd ever had of understanding something directly and not understanding it at the same time. So I was very intrigued, naturally. So I started to try and find out anything that anybody knew about Ibn Arabi. I discovered there were groups of people just beginning to study his work in translation in English only. So I joined a couple of study groups, and it was clear that this was something, let's say, absolutely compelling for me. I couldn't resist it. It was, and then there were a group of people who eventually what was established was a kind of school to which one could go for 6 months and study in depth. This was the Bashara School of Intensive Esoteric Education. And in the process of this 6-month course, I was introduced to Fusus al-Hikam, again in translation. We studied a little bit of Arabic, which I hadn't studied at that time at all. And I realized that this was probably the most important book I'd ever read. So one can say, in a way, that the hook, was the poem in the Tërgjمان, but then gradually you get pulled and pulled and pulled like a fish. And I suppose it's been going on ever since. I mean, my outer life, I became a teacher, not in this field at all, but all the time, from a personal point of view, I was involved in the study of Ibn Arabi. And then one thing led to another. I realized that there comes a point where I had to study it in the original, I felt, because I felt there was something more in the original that was untranslatable. And that's for sure. I've confirmed that feeling, but it also meant a lot of hard work because I had to teach myself Arabic, primarily to read Ibn Arabi. I really wasn't particularly interested in anything else, but that led on to, as one person said to me, well, the best way to teach yourself Arabic is read the Quran. So I took that piece of advice as well. And I'm a unusual character in all the kind of academic circles because I didn't go through the normal academic route of learning Arabic, of studying Ibn Arabi as a figure among other figures. No, that wasn't my interest. My interest was, what does he have to say to us today? And to me personally also, which is the same question. So that's a fairly long way of answering your question. In recent years, I think what has become obvious to me is the immense need for Ibn Arabi's teaching to be available to people. So most of my work today is to do with making it as available as possible. Now that might be in Arabic because the Arabic texts have not been done, so there's a lot of manuscript work that I got involved in, but it might also be in translation. and in giving talks and so on and so on. But the primary focus has always been that this is a man whose genius is, for me, unsurpassed in any language, anywhere in the world. And my great surprise really is always that he's so little known in the West, even today. So he's known among specialists, yes, but he's not known generally. The name Ibn Arabi does not come to people's lips in the way that, let's say, William Shakespeare does.
Great and very interesting introduction. So, after decades of being involved with Ibn Arabi, so what did Ibn Arabi had to say to you personally, mentally, spiritually, after all these years? Maybe in a summary before we begin.
I was going to say just carry on. I mean, the thing is that when you approach this figure of Ibn Arabi, there are so many possibilities of ways in, things that can interest you, things that can grab your attention. He's a great teacher. I mean, obviously, he's known as a Sheikh al-Akbar. So where is the student capable of actually facing that? I'm not talking about an external student. I mean, in ourselves, there is something in us which is a good student. We have to find this. You know, I think all of us have to find, how are we to approach Ibn Arabi? With what do we bring to the table? And to be a good student is quite something. It's not an easy matter. Now, when I recounted my original impression, it was all the action, as it were, was coming from his side. Here's a poem. What do you think of it? You know, and it goes like this. But after that initial kind of impact, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of processing, digesting, checking, cross-checking to be done inside, internally in the person, in order to verify what is this and what am I being told. So in the end, it's like being in the process of a great education. So he is a Sheikh al-Akbar, I have no doubt about it. It's not an epithet given lightly to him, but he has a very particular way of teaching, which is, you know, people have talked about it in different ways. I would say the most kind of distinctive feel I can express about it is that it's very challenging to the intellect, and very simultaneously it draws you in through the heart. So it's a very peculiar combination, because with many Sufi masters, for example, you can take what they say and almost hold it at arm's length. Say, very interesting, I like that. I don't think you can do this with Ibn Arabi at all. It doesn't work. You know, there's something organically demanding about his work. I mean, we can frame it very easily, and we can say, well, we know that he was inspired to write what he wrote. So this immediately puts it into a different category to normal books. And he's very specific. I don't write like other people write. Fine, okay. But the implication, of course, is, well, what's the purpose of it then? I mean, this outpouring of inspiration, it has to find its place of reception in us, in people. It was written for us. Well, I mean, he could have gone off, you know, and spent all his time in just with his own students and not written a thing. But he didn't. He was under this command to write. So I think, you know, it's a roundabout way of answering your question. is that the impact is always, you never know what's next. And that's certainly been my experience with the translation work and the writing or giving a talk. I might get invited to give a talk. I don't know what I'm going to talk about. I have no idea. They have a title, let's say, for a symposium, and you say, okay, what is to be talked about in this? And then you have to find out. And once you get a title, maybe it usually comes in a title, then you have to think, well, I don't know anything about this. I have to find out about it. So I'm always I found for myself, always being in this process of being in education is actually the key to it all. I don't feel that one can bring things to the table with Ibn Arabi and say, I've got this question about, the role of humanity. What is it? Well, you can approach him like that, but it's a bit, you determine your own results that way. Am I making sense? I mean, is that...
You have to sit as a student in Ibn Arabi school. He's just like, it's a journey of life, the journey of the soul. It's like Ibn Arabi is taking you to his ocean. So, normally students study the Irfani tradition, the Irfani text with a teacher, with a guide, with a master. But in your case, that you kept too much effort either to understand Arabic or to understand the text itself. So it's like a different approach of trying to understand.
Well, I had companions. We had let's say, somebody who described themselves not as a teacher but as a consultant, as a helper. And the primary reason for that was that he said, historically, Sufism has been let's say, a direct teaching from master to student. He said, but this is actually very high level. If you think of Rumi, for example, Jalaluddin Rumi, all his training from his father, from other masters, brought him to a point where he was teaching other people in the madrasa in Konya until the point where he met Shamsuddin Tabrizi. Shamsuddin Tabrizi is his initiator into the reality of what he was studying. But this, I mean, we were always told this is rare because this is going beyond things that you can talk about. So first, there's a lot of preparation work that needs to be done, a lot. And it's important to understand the nature of it because anybody setting themselves up as a teacher in this business is immediately they are limited by their own limitation. Now, Ibn Arabi doesn't have limits in that sense. So being brought to study is like when you go to university, you are expected to, certainly in Britain and in most universities today, you're expected to do your own research, do your own reading. Yes, you listen to this lecturer, you listen to another lecturer, but in the end, the whole point is you make up your own mind and you do your own research and you verify for yourself. Collectively, I think we can say that this is actually what is the norm today spiritually. It's not the case that we can look back in the past and say, okay, there was the Qadiriyya, Naqshbandiyya, Mevleviyya, etc., etc. Yes, these are traditions, and they had their own ways of working. But there was a period before where these things did not exist. It was much more fluid, and certainly in Ibn Arabi's life, it's clear that fluidity was normal. You did not have one master that you had to just adhere to. You had maybe several, you maybe had one, you maybe had several. In times of life, things would change. So I think as a model for today, that's very important to understand because so much of what is talked about is as if we were living in the 19th century. rather than the 21st. In the 21st century, in my lifetime, I know that a lot of spiritual traditions have become, they're closing down. That's to say, and I could give you examples across the world, actually, from the American Indians through to the Tibetans and so on. The teaching that was done by great masters to great students is being finished. That form of doing things is finishing. Well, that immediately suggests not a loss, but a change. There is something changing in the world. There's a new demand that's required of us. And we can see the expansion of education, general education among people, is like an outer aspect of this. So rather than going to a school where you learn from you go to the school and you learn history from this teacher, science from this teacher. No, it's not like that anymore. We are in a university level, collectively.
Mm-hmm.
If you get my kind of analogy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So collectively, we can cooperate, work together to try to understand the impact of Ibn Arabi's teaching. That doesn't make us teachers. It doesn't make us professors. It just makes us how good a student can we be in the face of this extraordinary outpouring that has happened.
And as we say in Arabic, طالب علم حقيقي. So, Professor, I'd like to delve with you on some of the meanings and insight of Ibn Arabi's thoughts, where you share it in several interesting articles. I'll start with this article, The Mystics' Ka'bah, Ka'batul Arifin in Arabic, the cubic wisdom of the heart according to Ibn Arabi. So you talk about the physical and social dimensions of the Ka'bah in the beginning and its relation with the heart of the human being. So what does the Ka'bah means for the mystic? For one who has penetrated beyond the surface appearance of things to the deep meanings of it. So in the beginning, before we delve more into the aspects of this article, so can you present a summary of it and the main idea of it that you're trying to talk about in this article? Normally people know about the Ka'bah, the Zahiri Ka'bah and the Hajj and these stuff, but they don't relate between the Ka'bah and the heart, between the Ka'bah and the spiritual aspect. So the whole article is trying to presenting at the other point of view.
Exactly. Well, let's sort of start with a basic arena. We are presented with many stories from tradition. By tradition, I mean religious tradition. And we are expected and told, do this, don't do that. Any normal human being at some point will question, why should I do this or do that? So in Islam, it is a requirement to face Mecca 5 times a day during the ritual prayer and to go on Hajj. And it's a symbolic center of the Islamic world, one can say. It is at the level of meaning, we have to say there might be something else going on, because however much socially this has brought people together, so that people go on Hajj and there's no distinctions about rich, poor, and so on. This is still not the level of the meaning of the Kaaba. And when Ibn Arabi, who obviously was a practicing Muslim, went on Hajj, spent 3 years at the Kaaba, and visited many times on pilgrimage, when he talks about it, you can tell that he's not so interested in it as a physical place, but as a living symbol for what is within us. So he's quite clear. He says it is the heart of the world. likewise, we have a heart. So all the representations of circumambulation of the Kaaba as a psychological or spiritual equivalent within us. Let's say we can say that our thoughts, our consciousness is circling about something we cannot name even. We're aware of its existence, but we are constantly circling around it, something. This identity that we call I. Now, for many people, they think they know what I is. They think they know their own identity. But if you look at this kind of ceaseless circumambulation, which continues, through the ages, through this daily practice which is going on, there's something which is being represented in the outer world, which has a meaning, a direct meaning within us. So his ability to correlate these two things, I think, is extremely interesting. Why, for example, is it a stone house? What does spiritual journeying mean? So we have the journey of pilgrimage, of getting to the Kaaba. We have the rituals that are associated with the Kaaba. What do they mean? So always the emphasis for Ibn Arabi, and I think for anybody in that sense following in his footsteps, is what does it mean? What is the let's say the revelatory aspect of this? As you probably know, in his own life, he describes an extraordinary event when he goes to the Kaaba and he starts reciting a poem in praise. Actually, it's in praise of the human being as being superior to the Kaaba, and the Kaaba gets angry with him and raises her skirts and as if to attack him. And he has to, the way he puts it is he has to recount 8 love letters to calm her down. Well, why 8, you would say? Well, we have a cubic house with 8 points, 4 upper, 4 lower. Each love letter is addressed to one of these corners to say, calm down, calm down. Just like if you had a cubic box in front of you, you would pick it up and hold it so that it doesn't move. So this is a way of describing something of an experience of the world which Ibn Arabi was in, but it has an impact for us because these love letters are astonishing. This is the Taj al-Rasail, by the way, in Arabic. They're all in a kind of rhyming prose, saja, and very beautiful, very difficult to translate, difficult to comprehend even. But the basic impact of this collection is very clear. It's a direct relationship with the Kaaba, in inverted commas, but not the Kaaba that you see photographs of. This is the living entity. So that's the whole point, that the Kaaba is a living entity, just like we are living entities. And we have to treat its place in the world properly. It represents something. It represents something of our reality, but it also is a living entity in the exterior, which has to be treated well, let's say.
So what was the result of this incident with the Kaaba, between Ibn Arabi and the Kaaba?
To calm down, apparently. and as
so
you know,
the meaning of that, who's the greater, the heart of a person or the heart of the Arif or the Kaaba itself or the...
Well, that's what's very interesting in the thing. So what you have is a representation. Each of the letters, for example, comes from an aspect, we can say an aspect of Ibn Arabi, but it's maybe Abd al-Alim, the servant of the all-knower, or Abd al-Shakur, the servant of the grateful. And so you can see that there are these 8 actually are divine names. They are the primary divine names. So what is the Kaaba then? The Kaaba itself is like the essence, that which is named by all the names. And it has these primary corners, which
so that الهوية الغيبية, so for example.
Exactly. And that's very interesting because it immediately opens up a whole new dimension of contemplation. And I think, coming back to something I was saying earlier about the impact of Ibn Arabi, that's what his writing is for, to open up a person's contemplation of reality, of their own reality, but also the reality, because it's not separate. So that kind of process through his writing, through the study, in inverted commas, is a very, very important part of the process of coming to terms with what he wrote. Mm-hmm. In the case of the Kaaba, we can say, okay, there are when you look at where he talks about it in his writing, you can see, for example, there's a chapter in Futuhat, I think, which turns out to be the very center of the book, and it's talking about the heart of the world and the heart of man. So it's like the Kaabic center, we could call it, of the book. Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, these Meccan illuminations. Why Meccan? Because they are connected in some way with the whole process of the Kaaba and of circumambulation and so on. So the book itself is like is the life of this circumambulating, contemplative life. Actually, I'm reminded that perhaps contemplative might need to be qualified a little bit, because some people think that being a contemplative means something otherworldly, something where you are turning your back on the world and contemplating God in your own private retreat. For Ibn Arabi, it is definitely not like that.
Because هو لا هو, so you have a face towards God and وجه إلى الحق وجه إلى الخلق, both.
Yes, and also the whole world is a tajalli, and therefore you're not separated. There's nowhere where are you going to run from and to? He is the one you run from, and he is the one you run to. So that understanding, I think, is very different to what is normally meant by being a contemplative. But it is full of contemplations, these mashahid. They have to be witnessed, you have to see. Mm-hmm. So vision is very important.
It's interesting that you mentioned that Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyya and the information mentioned in this article, it's all in the Baraka and in the context of Mecca and the Ka'bah, and even Turjuman al-Ashwaaq, I guess that he wrote it there.
Yes, there are certain, let's call them Meccan works. Turjuman is another one. Totally different in flavor, style, everything. Relying on the old Bedouin imagery of the desert and the beloved who's just left the campsite and all these things. So a whole tradition of poetry. But I think that one should understand the Tarjuman, at least on one level, as being saying, okay, there is this form of poetry that people have used. But what is it really about? Because if the beloved is one, then whoever you think your beloved is, you cannot be apart from this one. So in a sense, it's a celebration of this style of poetry, formal style of poetry, but at a very elevated level, mm-hmm. at a spiritual level.
And I think he himself, he explained it by the Khair al-A'laq. So when you see the Khair al-A'laq, and then when you see other commentaries also of it.
Yeah, the funny thing is that, I mean, I have friends who think that, to explain poetry in prose is a joke, because what you're explaining in the prosaic way is for the level of the mind. But the actual poem has an impact. It has an impact in language, it has an impact in its flow and in its imagery, which does not need explanation because it's quite direct. So for Ibn Arabi, actually, the world is poetry. It's not prose. Prose is something that we create it as structure. But he's very clear that the poetic resonance, the harmony which is in the natural world, it's in the universe, is equally present in humanity and in human creation, but specifically in poetry.
Doctor, I'd like to delve more in the meanings of this article, and I'll ask you in a bit about this famous poem, My Heart Has Become Receptacle of All Forms, and your special understanding about this. But here you mentioned in the article also about Abu Sa'id Abu al-Khair in a certain story when he says it is no great matter that you should tread under your feet 1,000 miles of ground in order to visit a stone house. The true man of God sits where he is, and the celestial house, Al-Bayt al-Ma'mur, comes several times in a day and night to visit him and perform circumambulation. You mean tawaf here, circumambulation? And performs tawaf above his head. Look and see. All who were present looked and saw it. And this refers also to the قلب المؤمن عرش الله.
Yes, I mean, these stories are to try to get away from the material mind that we all suffer from. We think that if we go from here to Mecca, we will perform the pilgrimage by doing. Well, maybe. I mean, one aspect, yes. But another aspect, more central aspect, definitely not. And there's a very famous story, which I also mentioned in the article, which Ibn Arabi quotes, of a Shibli, of a conversation where somebody has done his duty and gone and done the pilgrimage and come back. And then a Shibli questions him, what did you actually, what did you do? Oh, well, let me see if I can find the little bit that I was thinking of. Shibli asked me, did you remove your clothes in order to put on the pilgrim's robe? Yes, I replied. He asked me, did you at the same time remove all your own acts, your own actions? No, I said. Then he said, you did not divest yourself of your clothing. So each step of the way, there are certain things which are done, practices, which are just that, practices. They are not the reality. But we take them, because of our material mind, we take it as the reality. And this is problematic for us. It's problematic when we talk about Sufism, because those who really practice Sufism, that's what they're interested in, is what does it mean? How far does it go? He asked, did you purify yourself with a full ablution? Yes, I replied. And did you purify yourself from all your faults? No, I replied. But then you didn't do the full ablution. So you can see that this is a matter of consciousness and transformation of consciousness. And it's not a matter of doing. The actions are important. Don't get me wrong. It's not that you can say, oh, it doesn't matter. No, it does matter, but it has to be done consciously, with full consciousness of what is actually involved. And that means understanding many different levels of ourselves, understanding that, if you like, we're a bit like, when you say an onion, we have an outer layer, but then there are inner layers and inner layers and inner layers. So we must be respectful of not only the fact that this is how we are, but also that other people are also exactly the same.
So, Professor, another interesting symbol that exists here, it's about tawaf, because when people do tawaf, so they are يطوفون on their egos, on their identities, or they're searching about their real souls, as you mentioned. So the symbol is that the person is in a journey of finding his soul in life.
Yes, and again, there are different levels that we can talk about. So, I don't know what, I mean, there are many things that could be said. I'm not sure where you want me to go with that. But I would just say each of the corners of the Kaaba, they have a physical direction, and the physical direction has a meaning for Ibn Arabi. The fact that it's the Yemeni corner is significant. The fact that it's the Syrian corner is significant. So we have to take each of the elements carefully when we study Ibn Arabi.
What's the symbolism of these corners and the differences between them? So, for example, the Yemeni and the...
So, for example, in the case of Yemen, as you know, there's a famous tradition of the Prophet. I smell the Nafas ar-Rahman coming to me from the Yemen, which he often quotes in connection with this Yemeni
Uwais al-Qarani.
Uwais al-Qarani, exactly. But that's one meaning of it. So there are many other meanings of it, which are non-historical. The Yemen corner is, for Ibn Arabi, associated with Jesus. And one would have to go into why and how. So as you know, the breeze that comes from the Yemen is a sweet, gentle, beautiful breeze, let's call it. And the representative of all those qualities in himself is Jesus. So the opposite is the northern corner, the Iraqi corner, and for Ibn Arabi that's associated with a certain kind of harshness. So we even find this in the derivation of the words. As you know, Yamin is to do with right. So we have the idea that the right hand is there. So we've got a lot of association with apparently different elements, but they all come together in the seeing, in the contemplation of what these things are. So one aspect of the Kaaba, let us say, is the black stone. It's part of the Kaaba. From another point of view, this black stone represents the point which is manifest as the Kaaba. Now I'm putting it like that because from all the traditions we know, the black stone is the kind of original bit around which the Kaaba was constructed. What does this represent? If we were to go into geometry, for example, we would understand that the very first thing that happens when you make a mark on a piece of paper is a dot. This is what the black stone represents. So in one respect, that's all that's happened. That black stone is the Kaaba. In another respect, it's part of the Kaaba. So they're not mutually exclusive viewpoints, they're just different viewpoints on the same thing. So from one point of view, we see it as the Kaaba itself. From another point of view, we see it as part of the Kaaba. As part of the Kaaba, it is one part of the Tawaf. As kissing it means now that you are, how can you say, you are coming as close as possible to the dotness of this place, which is of course the same dot everywhere, but it's represented in the Kaaba. very direct.
So it's a symbol of fana, for example.
It's a symbol of, yes, not just fana, but also
being totally burned in the that, maybe.
Yeah, there are treatises written about the meaning of this istilam, which is, the kissing, and how important it is. How it's done, why it's done. Why it's done is important. So the more we comprehend this, the better. Because then when we enact it with all of our being, not with only a bit, not with just a physical part, not just with our heads, no, with our whole being, we understand it. So that comes again back to something mentioned right at the beginning of Ibn Arabi's life, when he goes to see one of his spiritual masters in Andalusia, a woman who says, of all the people who come to visit me, Ibn Arabi is the one I like the most. And the other students want to know why. Why is that? And she says, because when he comes with all of himself. When he sits with all of himself. When he speaks with all of himself. When he leaves with all of himself. So you can see that early on Ibn Arabi was blessed with this direct
involvement and hudur and presence and
precisely presence.
So going back to the Al-Hajar al-Aswad, the black stone, so when we want to reflect its symbolism on the heart itself and the dot itself and kissing the heart, kissing the Hajar al-Aswad, so how can we reflect it on the heart? Because really the Ka'bah in the article is at the heart of the Al-Arif al-Wasal or Insan al-Kamil.
Well, this is the point where the manifest and the hidden join. You can say, just like the symbol of the dot on the paper, there is a pen which is invisible to the paper. The paper is blank, but the mark of the pen on the paper is one. And that's all it does. Actually, it only makes one mark. You might say from the point of view of the paper, well, there's a line, but actually the pen, from the point of view of the pen, there's only one thing happening. The pen is not simultaneously in different places like on our modern, printers. That's why the symbol of the pen is so important to kind of grapple with. So there is a pen in a vertical dimension. There is a dot that appears on the horizontal dimension and is like the interface between the vertical and the horizontal. So it represents, in that sense, the barzakh between manifest and hidden, between the human and the divine, and it's never not present. It is always present. Whatever the state or level of understanding or degree of comprehension of what we call a mystic or a contemplative, that's all there is. And it's the degree to which that is manifest that matters. In other words, manifest in knowledge, not manifest in practices necessarily, but manifest in the knowing quality of the human being.
Mm-hmm.
The more that manifests, the more, as it were, the divine is able to manifest as the human. Not in the human, but as the human.
Mm-hmm. So, Doctor, you mentioned also here something about the different angles of the Kaaba, where we have the but here, does it relate also to the المشارب الروحية? So, for example, المشرب العيسوي is this side, and then you said the other side is the powerful. So it's المشرب الموسوي, for example. So you're making tawaf and you're getting to know, or you try to embody different masharib through your spiritual journey.
Well, absolutely. That's what I was alluding to. That there is this, that you are going from one station to another station to another station in the tawaf. So what is being represented externally is something that is a complete reality internally for the person who is awake. So for Ibn Arabi, the four aspects would be the four supports, the autad. And each support or corner, let's say, is under the jurisdiction of a prophetic figure, prophetic reality. And I put it like that because I want to get away from the idea that, let's say, the spiritual reality of these prophets is not necessarily what people imagine them to be. Not necessarily at all. So we talk about Jesus, we know stories about Jesus, but have we met Jesus? It's a different question. Many people would say, well, come on, it's not possible. Or other people will say, I had a dream in which, he appeared. We have a whole range of experience, human experience. But to go into Ibn Arabi's experience is to enter the place where the person is describing their spiritual experience in terms that we can understand. So let's take, for example, these four, because that seems to be where we're heading with this question. We have the corner that I talked about of Jesus of the Yemen, where you would say, okay, from the point of view of the directions, that's the right, and the opposite one would be the north, which is the station of Hira. Very interesting figure. He's the only one of the four who is not, let's say, a full-blown prophet, but he's like a prophet.
He's even more.
Well, not exactly even more. He's this particular corner of Iraq for Ibn Arabi is associated with each of these four represent thoughts. So let's say you can have divine thoughts, angelic thoughts, psychic thoughts, nafsi thoughts. You can also have satanic thoughts. This gradation. So for those who this is a description of the human experience of life. So these thoughts are like the pilgrims circumambulating. They circumambulate a place, in inverted commas, a center, which we call the heart. And they take more or less prominence depending on what we do. Because when thoughts come to us, we respond to them. This is one of the meanings, by the way, of the poem. My heart has become capable of all forms. Qابلا is receptive towards all forms. And it receives, but then there is a thing that happens for the human being. They make something of these thoughts. They either distinguish them for what they are, for the fully illuminated one, or they're attracted by something and they kind of lock on. So we know that thought patterns, continue in the mind, usually negative thought patterns and so on, and they reinforce each other and so on and so on and so on. This is how we talk about it in modern terms, but in traditional terms, let's say, the emptiness of the heart at the center is constantly being filled up with thought of one kind or another. We have to distinguish the truth or not of these thoughts that come to us. On what basis do we distinguish them? It may be that we use our mind to do so. This doesn't seem like a very nice thought about somebody or myself. this seems like a very pleasurable thought, I'll follow it, and so on and so on. We have to learn a great deal about ourselves in the process. But from Ibn Arabi's point of view, these are actually tajalli. These are manifestations, self-manifestations at different levels. So for the person who is completely illuminated, there are actually only three, because there's divine, there's angelic, and there's psychic, let's say, nafsi. The satanic one disappears because that's to do with distance. So now let's come back to the story of Khidr's involvement in all this. That place is to do with the recognition that there is no distance in reality. That's what Khidr's role in the world is, to bring people to the place where there's no distance between their consciousness and their reality.
Connected between Zahir and Batin, no separation, because he realizes the Batin.
Well, he knows the Batin, exactly. So the stories of him and Moses, for example, are to do with this apparent divide between the Zahir and the Batin, which from the standpoint of Khidr actually it doesn't exist. That he respects that the Zahir has its own rules and regulations, because it's under the authority of a prophet. It's not under the authority of somebody below Khidr, not at all. In fact, Moses is in one respect superior, but in another respect inferior. Very complicated. That's a whole other discussion.
Khidr also reminds Musa with three aspects that happened with him in the past. So it's like a phenomenological or an irfani analysis. So Khidr combines between Zahir and Batin, reminds Musa that just be aware of what happened to you before. It's not that, it's just like he's enlightening him to a certain.
So that's what I was trying to say, that Khidr's role is to bring somebody to the point where the distance between Zahir and Batin disappears, because they're just faces of the same thing. So that's his role. Now, once that's happened in a person, then, because it is a possibility for anyone to be brought to that kind of realization, that to go beyond the illusion of things, to go beyond the illusion of separation. If that person has reached such a point, then of necessity, what happens to them is describable only by the other three. And he describes these in different ways. He says, well, actually, the west wind, I think it's the west wind. That would be turning your back on the beloved, and you don't do that, because you face the east, you have the right and the left. So he's even got a way of saying, actually, there are things that happen when you're face to face with the divine, whether in unity or in multiplicity, where you are never separate. So distance disappears. It doesn't mean that there isn't further away and closer. No, I don't mean that. I just mean that you are never apart from your own reality, and you know that. You're aware of it. Mm-hmm. So you are not susceptible to what 99.9% of humanity is susceptible to. So this is the possibility that is held out to people, because the reality of distance is that there isn't any. That we were never apart from the presence. What we call absence and presence is from our point of view, because we are still in separation. Mm-hmm. So I think, going back to this Kaaba and the four corners, this contemplation of circumambulation is astonishing, because actually what it comes down to is you're moving from let's say, the eastern pole through the different degrees and back. And constantly there is this movement which is happening to us the whole time. So it's a representation of human experience in a very concrete form, beautiful concrete form. That's why it's symbolic.
Yeah, and Dr. here also you mentioned a very interesting thing is that the mystic Kaaba and pluralism, where you mentioned this saying of Rumi, for some the road is from Antalya, for some from Syria, for some from Persia, for some from China, for some by sea, by sea from India and Yemen. Once they have arrived at the Kaaba, it is realized that that were for this man saying to that man, you are false or you're infidel, and the other replying in kind, was concerning the roads only, and that their goal was one. So it's interesting talking about الطرق إلى الله بعدد أنفاس الخلائق. They're all seeking to reach a certain place, and then in the Zahiri issue they fight, but when they reach they discover that the roads all led to a same place.
Yes, and even if we have not arrived, we can appreciate that this must be the case. And it's emphasized a great deal that everything that the prophets have brought is the same thing, same truth, just it needs reiterating in a different way for different people. Different aspect is brought out. This is the kind of, let's say, flexibility that humanity needs to develop, because we see in the world today so many assumptions made that I have found the truth and I'm going to tell you what it is. So that goes back right to the beginning of what I was talking about when we were discussing how to study Ibn Arabi. I think this is a tremendous training in accepting other points of view to your own as valid, interesting, revealing, and something to be cherished, not to be opposed. Now, if somebody is of the opinion that they are in opposition to others, that creates difficulty for everybody. But we are being forced, I think, in the world today to unite in a proper sense, not by uniformity of some sort of communist ideology.
Not neglecting differences.
Not neglecting differences. On the contrary, appreciating difference. So in my experience, studying Ibn Arabi is very interesting with a group of people, because what happens is people bring different aspects out. And the more kind of practiced they are, the more this happens, and it's a celebration of what's in the text. It's not a limitation at all, and it's not speculation either. It's a celebration of the diversity of meaning. So we tend to think, okay, we have this sentence, it means X. That's what it means. And then if you hear somebody else saying, well, actually, I see it rather differently, and it also means Y, I'm not going to say it doesn't mean X, that's fine, but that's at one level. At another level, it can mean this. And you go, oh, now that's interesting. So that it's an opening up of different perspectives on the same reality.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And for me, that goes back to your question about why Ibn Arabi. That's it. You know?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think another analysis of this very beautiful poem of Turjمان الأشواق, what you mentioned also in the article, the heart has 6 faces, just as the cube has 6 faces. And this is related to the poem, my heart has become receptive of all forms. It's a pasture for gazelles, and a monastery for Christian monks, and a temple for idols, and the pilgrim for Ka'bah, and the tables of Torah, and the book of Quran. So we find also 6 forms mentioned in this poem, and related to different levels of heart, or different levels of realization, or different levels of respecting the differences, or different tejalliyat. So how to explain it here?
Well, in the poem, you're quite right, there are 6 elements which are talked about. And you're quite right to say the cube has 6 faces. There is a short treatise that he wrote called The Faces of the Heart, and that he goes into the difference between the six in a different way, without relationship to the Kaaba, doesn't talk about it. So there are many questions that come up. Okay, we want to know about each of the six and what do they do and so on. But let's just take the Kaaba itself. One face is to the ground. Otherwise the Kaaba has no support. So that's very important. This face is invisible. You cannot see the bottom of the Kaaba. When people do tawaf, they go around four. But there's another one, which is above, which you cannot see when you're doing the circumambulation. So the upper one is also invisible. So now we have an interesting situation. We have four faces visible, two faces invisible, one open, one closed, in inverted commas. Yeah? One to the ground, one to the sky. So these are not, I mean, we could say, well, that's just how it is. No, symbolically, this is very interesting. Very interesting. And in the passage where he discusses the six faces of the heart, he actually does go into, you can see, without him saying it, you can see that one of them is definitely the one on the ground. Because there's this, let's say, it's a kind of taslim that he talks about, where we become like ground and we accept our servanthood absolutely and totally, just like the bottom of the Kaaba sits securely on the ground. It doesn't fly off anywhere. We say, well, this is a very important principle that we have to incorporate into our own life. It's not something you do. I mean, many people would understand taslim as something, you have to do. It's not. It's something that is. It's an existential fact in the face of the presence. So this is just one example.
What about the top of the Kaaba, which is facing the sky?
It faces the sky, absolutely. And it receives what? Receives the rain directly. It's the only face that receives the rain directly. And rain is rahmah and so on. So you can see that all the elements of this are modes of contemplation. That's the kind of basis of it. Now, one other factor, which I don't think I put it into that paper. Some people might say, why six? What is so important about six? And in fact, in the treatise on the six faces, Ibn Arabi says, well, some people say there are 8, but according to us, there are only 6. So according to some people, they talk about the corners of the Kaaba. There are 8 corners, yes. But we're talking about faces now. We're talking about, let's say, areas of contemplation. We could put it like that. The number 6 in Ibn Arabi's writing is an extremely important number, and it became more or less commented on in the later tradition, because it is the number of, there's 2 things about it. First of all, it's a perfect number. That's to say, it's the sum of its divisors. 1 plus 2 plus 3 is 6. It's the first of these, what the Greeks call perfect numbers. It's the first. The second one is 28. So then you ask, is it an accident that there are 28 letters in the Arabic alphabet? Is it an accident that there are 28 mansions of the moon? Okay, there are these correlations which we have to take very seriously. Now, the other correlation with the number 6, particularly, is in the Arabic abjad system, alphanumeric system, where it is the letter waw. And for Ibn Arabi, the letter waw is the symbol in the letters of the perfect man, the perfect human being, because it comes at the end of the articulation process from the chest and the air coming out, the final letter that can be articulated is what? Wow. So that means that the perfect human being is the final resume of all the other degrees of existence, just as the letter wow is the final letter that can be articulated. So you can see now its association with 6 is very important. That means that the Kaaba itself is equally a representation of the perfect human being. Not just the heart this time, not just, let's say, an interior aspect, not at all. It's the whole thing. And one can go on in many, many ways.
So does these 6 faces also reflect the 6 levels of the soul, if we can say al-aql, al-qalb, al-ruh, al-sir, al-khafi, al-akhfa, or the names of the soul that are mentioned in the Quran, al-sadr, al-fuad, al-qalb, al-lub, like this?
It could be, but I've never seen a place where Ibn Arabi himself talks of it like that. So I think these are, these are things where the intellect starts to come in and starts to correlate things, and we're very good, we're very smart, especially these days. I would personally, I would sit with a question like that and see what happens. If it leads to a contemplation, fine.
You mentioned in the article something also related to the different levels of heart, and you mentioned al-fuad and al-sadr and al-ruh. I don't know how you relate it to the mystic Ka'bah.
Well, because there is a tradition in Sufism of talking of different levels of the heart. So we in English, unfortunately, we have a very restricted vocabulary. We only have one word, heart, and it's very difficult to translate these other words because in their root they have particular meanings. In their usage in the Quran, they also have particular meanings, and again, all of them have been much commented on in Ibn Arabi's work and Sadruddin Konavi and so on. So it's very difficult to translate what's going on. But all I would say is that they are certainly ways of looking at what we call heart. Each one has its own character, clearly. So Sadr, we understand, is the kind of, we could say breast or chest, like they do in some of the translations. So it's the most outer aspect, and it's related to Sadra, which of course is to do with emerging, coming out. So there are interesting reflections that appear every now and again. I don't think Ibn Arabi systematizes anything particular, because very often he's quite careful not to, not to kind of fix, this is how it is, because it may be like this in one way, and another
He gives
way.
Insights.
Yeah,
and about Sadr also, in Shirah al-Sadr, the Quran talks, أَفَمَنْ شَرَحَ اللَّهُ صَدْرَهُ, so it's an inside aspect, so not only an outside.
Exactly. But it's an outer aspect of the heart, one could say. I mean, not just a physical thing, but the outer aspect of the heart. He would tend to use the word sadr if he wanted to emphasize it. But there are plenty of cases where he uses the word fuad in poems, for example, and you don't know whether he has in mind qalb, really, but it's just for the poetic rhythm that he's using fuad, or does he really mean fuad with all its kind of, context? That's difficult. That's where lots of interesting discussion takes place when we try to translate things or talk about things.
Doctor, I'd like to ask you more also about the interesting poem in ترجمان الأشواق لقد صار قلبي. So he uses here قلب, and you mentioned also in the article قلب because of the تقلب, and تقلب in different God's manifestations, and because it reflects the station of no station, or the station of Insan al-Kamil. Here he's talking about which a person which doesn't limit himself with a certain tajalli. He talks about 6 tajallis, so he's witnessing God in all different sorts and kinds of tajallis, and this is the characteristic of this qalb, which is yataqallab. And this is also related to pluralism. He can witness God in different تجليات. So I don't know how we can elaborate more here.
Yeah, no, I think you put it very well. I mean, first of all, the qalb is related, as you said, تقلب, to this idea of turning, and even inqilab, so we have a reversal. So it has the ability to change and to turn. So we, all of us, have this ability to change, but we resist it because of our intellect on the whole, because we force ourselves to be a certain way. We think of ourselves a certain way. We think of other people a certain way, and we don't allow the variety to actually manifest itself. So that relates directly to the meaning of qalb. And in one of his prayers, he asks, give me a qalb, because it's actually a gift. We have this potentially in us, but we have to awaken this qalb, which is qabil, same three letters, but a little reversal, which is receptive, which is able to receive.
قابل وقبول وقابلية, and then he's talking about the capacity, the capability.
Capacity, exactly. This capacity to receive is not limited like we think it is. We tend to think, because we think of ourselves a certain way, we therefore limit our capacity to receive. But we don't realize that the reality of life at each moment is that we have the capacity to receive the next moment completely. Which means that this possibility of unlimited reception is always present in us. We don't have to do something to merit it. We don't have to undo something that is blocking it. It's present. For this reason, Ibn Arabi says that the mirror of the heart is always clean. And yet at the same time, it needs polishing. We need to make the effort to be receptive. It's a very curious paradox that we're in. We are always at this juncture between what we call past and what we call future, in what we call this now. So this now, which is presence, is always has the possibility of full receptivity in it. Otherwise, we would not be human beings.
So we have a clean and a pure mirror, but we have to get rid of the dust that's coming. Yeah.
That's the kind of implication, yes, which is actually identical to what we see in a physical mirror. It's not that you polish the mirror and make it something it isn't. No, you simply
make it return back to its original position.
Precisely, you return it to its original receptivity, and that requires work. So that's where the work is. The work is not in becoming receptive. The work is in removing what is preventing you from being receptive.
So, Doctor, can we say here that he's talking, the Insan al-Kamil, he's like on the top of the mountain, and he can recognize and understand and respect all the different paths that are trying to seek to God and trying to reach towards God. Or it's like we say the shallal of water, which the different هذا تخرج منه طرق مختلفة يعني. So the one on the top, he can see all these different roads. That all these different roads will emerge at the end, and then the main road. So at-turuq will go and will go back to the Sirat al-Mustaqim. And this is a kind of pluralism that we can find in Irfan. And once before you mentioned to me that there's a difference between Allah or the الإله عند الناس, in the Fص al-Dawudi, where he says الله في عقلك أو الله في الحقيقة. So it's a different two kinds.
Yes, and you can say in a way that someone on a journey to the destination, to what they take as the destination, is in one kind of condition, and the person who has reached the destination, who is not, it's not a fixed destination, is in a different condition, and it's not easy to understand what that condition is, even though it's always present, always informing us, and so on. It's not easy because we are so full of I'm on this road, which is not that road. I'm like this, and I'm not like that. We have many, many things to overcome as obstructions to this clarity of vision, because that's in the end what it's about, clarity of vision. So you can say, for example, going back to the numbers, we say 6, but actually 6, what is it? Is it the same as 1, or is it different to 1? Or is it neither the same nor different?
It is 6 ones.
Well, in one respect, it's 6 ones. But where does the 6 come from then?
The repetition of 1.
Yes, so it's implied in 1. And yet at the same time, all that appears is actually the 1. But the 1 can appear as 6, and the 1 can appear as 3, and so on. And it has a different flavor, different manifestation, different knowledges and revelations associated with it. So that's why you can look at the Kaaba, for example, and you can say, yes, it has 4 aspects. Yes, it has 6 aspects. Yes, it has 8 aspects. Yes, it has 1 aspect. All of them are to be appreciated, not by saying one is better than the other, or this is the only way of looking at it, or anything like that.
So the divine form can take all different kinds, the divine reality can take all different kinds of forms, based on the Junaid saying also, لون الماء بلون إنائه, depending on our different capacities, will manifest different levels.
Yes, yes. But should I mention? Yes, I should mention, because the book will come out very soon. I've been working with my friend Pablo Beneto on a prayer on the Prophet, very well-known prayer on the Prophet, which is attributed to Ibn Arabi, called As-Salat al-Faydiyya. Now, we've done a lot of work on it. Inshallah, it could be out quite short time. We're hoping the next month and a half, something like this. In the process of doing the work on it, we've been studying the writings of a man called Abdullah Bosnevi. He was an Ottoman commentator on Lefصوص, very, very well known in the Ottoman world, less so in outside that, because although he wrote his commentary also in Arabic, it's not even been printed yet as a publication. We are still waiting for the edition to come out. Now, one of the things he says, referring to this poem that you mentioned, or not poem, this saying of Junaid about the color of water being the color of its receptacle, he has a wonderful, wonderful poem, which I wonder if I can quote for you. I can give you the gist of the poem, which is, they say that the color of water is the color of its receptacle. Now, in this moment, al-an, ana, I, am that water, bila lawn, without color. So why is this such an important poem? Because it takes away the apparent kind of, there's an apparent problem about where are you in the color of the water is the color of its receptacle. If you're just a receptacle, then you are effectively a limiting factor on the divine. The human being who really realizes, like you were talking about, being the top of the pyramid, is in a different condition to this, because they don't have the colors of the different ways anymore. They see them all, but they're not colored by them. They don't say, I prefer this part to that part. No, they are already, let's say, total. They have a total vision. They're a total person, total integration. Sometimes Ibn Arabi even uses the word al-insan al-kulli to describe this kind of
who got rid of all limitations, of all kind of limitations.
Exactly.
So subhanallah عما يصفون إلا عباد الله المخلصين. So they got rid of these limitations, because we say subhanallah عما يصفون. But there is the الاستثناء, which is عباد الله المخلصين, which they are above these limitations, or above the ألوان الآنية المختلفة. So they have no color, they are colorless.
But they have no color and they're colorless, and the only thing which is colorless is the water. So in that sense, and he plays with the ana, al-an. So you're not quite sure what he means by al-an. Is it now at this moment? Is it the fact that al-an, now, is all that is? This is the reality of human consciousness. Right at the beginning, I think of the Hira paper, I quoted something from a Tibetan, because I thought it summarizes the kind of
when you say you live in illusion and the appearance of things, there is a reality, but you do not know this. When you understand this, you will see that you are nothing, and being nothing, you are everything. That is all.
That's it. So you can see here, when it says you will see that you are nothing, you will see you are not, in that sense, in the color idea, you're not a colored receptacle. You're not a receptacle. You are nothing. When we talk about servanthood, ubudiyya, we do not mean that the servant exists. We simply mean that they are the place of manifestation of the Lord. That's what they are, and that's what's known.
محل التجلي, موضع التجلي, we say. Oh, they're only مواضع للتجلي.
Exactly.
So they're only reflecting.
Exactly. So this goes back to our discussion about the heart and being a reflective substance. There's nothing there but the pure reflectivity, if you like, this ability to reflect. And being nothing, he says, you are everything. Well, of course, because every form then, going back to our poem in the Tejliyat, every form is reflected in this heart, what we call heart. And he says that's all. I mean, there's an astonishingly modern, framing of exactly the same realization. And the problem we have is, if we have a problem, is, as he says, you live in illusion and the appearance of things. And there is a reality, but you don't know this. It's very simple. It's very, very simple. And all spirituality, all spiritual teaching, all prophetic is designed to bring people to know reality directly and to know that they are nothing. I mean, this is what is the reality of fana, but the reality of fana is also baqa. It's not even to talk about it as two sides of the same coin is not really quite right. They're the same thing.
Nothingness and everythingness is in the same time.
Exactly.
Same moment.
So go ahead.
So what I meant before about الفص الداودي, الدين عند الله والدين عند الناس. So we should overcome the limitations of the دين عند الناس, which is different forms, which is ألوان الآنية, and to reach the دين عند Allah. I think that this is what you mean.
Exactly. This is in the اليعقوبي chapter. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand the distinction, very important. So we have great help and support from Ibn Arabi in the sense that he's laid out so many things as pointers and different ways in. But in the end, it all comes down to the same thing. You know, that well, one can say it in Quranic language: God is, and there is not with him a thing. So if that's how the Quran puts it, that means that
كان الله ولم يكن معه شيء. You mean this is a hadith, or you mean a certain ayah also? أينما تولوا فثم وجه الله, you mean?
Qana Allah is, yes, is the exactly, it's a hadith, isn't it? So this is a strictly clear saying, very clear. You know, it appears not like that, but that's what the reality is. So that's what has to be come to know. To come to know that means that you are no longer a thing. You're not a something.
You also end your article also, I think, by mentioning at the end, when you talk about the faces of oneness, you say this is how we are to understand the prophet's action in Mecca when he caused the idols to prostrate rather than destroying them. So what's the symbolism here of not destroying them?
Well, if let's say there are faces of worship in the world, and you could say, well, there's only one to worship, so let's, you know, all the rest should be destroyed. This is the classic iconoclasm that has bedeviled Islam and Christianity and Judaism for centuries. People have had problems with this. If something is, let's say, the clothes that we wear, you don't have a problem of identity. You don't think that they are you. You know they're clothes. And they're worn for social reasons, for outer reasons, we might say. Exactly the same thing. There is the reality which assumes different guises. And one day they want to be in a red cloak. In the next day, they want to be, you know, in a suit, a black suit. Why is it a problem? The problem is not that there is difference. The problem is in us in not accepting difference as being from his side, not from ours. So the destruction of the idols would have meant destroying, burning all the clothes and saying, no, you know, this should be naked. No, it's not like that. It just means that everything, all the clothing, as it were, is in prostration. It's to be used as the person wishes, whenever they wish, however they wish. Some people think that they're worshipping money, for example. And they have no idea that God is the reality of money. That's what they worship. You can't be separated from God by money. This is not possible. This is one of the meanings that Ibn Arabi draws out of the Quranic verse about, you know, I've only created the men and the jinn to worship me, to be my servant. Well, of course. How else could it be? So again, comes back to being a servant, what it means.
العبادة التكوينية, العبادة الذاتية. And then,
exactly.
Also, I recall now in your article when you mention also this beautiful hadith, ما وسعني أرضي ولا سمائي ولكن وسعني قلب عبدي المؤمن. So you say, سمائي, it is البيت المعمور, أرضي, it is الكعبة. So here where the superiority of the إنسان الكامل becomes over the Kaaba and over the بيت المعمور even. So because the only receptive is this heart.
But that's exactly the problem that Ibn Arabi had in front of the Kaaba, which I mentioned in the story. That was what he was celebrating. He was celebrating the superiority of the perfect human being over the Kaaba. And the Kaaba got angry. said, "How dare you? How many people have come around me, before you?" So he was told off, as it were, for being quite so presumptuous. And that's interesting because it reflects then on how we are to understand the perfect human being. We have to understand the principle. We have to also understand that there's a question of adab in it, how to actually treat what is not an idea, actually, it's a reality. So the perfect man, as such, is for us a principle. But at the same time, there's nothing that isn't that perfect man. So you can't say that he is, the Kaaba is a lesser being. On the contrary, at the level of the Kaaba and the level of the difference, one thing expresses closeness more than another. So that has to be respected too. So it's a very, very important.
But that's Ibn Arabi, the perfect man himself, or the Prophet himself. He's surely higher than everything other than him, other than God.
But he also circumambulated the Kaaba. Mm-hmm. He also kissed the black stone. And we should not forget. This is why.
And he did that not only with his Zahiri body, but with his body that contained his soul and all his levels. So there is a kind of unity, kind of harmony that we should discover also.
Yes, he is showing us, in other words, the story of Ibn Arabi shows us exactly the same thing as the Prophet doing the Tawaf. Why, if he is the Prophet and he is the exemplar, why does he need to do it? Because it shows us something about how to be a real human being at the same time. So following the model of the Prophet is one of the most important elements in the whole exposition of Ibn Arabi.
Mm-hmm. And also, Dr. When you mentioned the relation between letters and the existence, because Ibn Arabi also says, like, just as the Quran is the words and letters of God, all the existence, all the creatures are also letters and words of God. So here you mention also for Ibn Arabi there is a complete parallelism between the formation of words and formation of the universe, between the 28 Arabic letters and the 28 mentions of the moon, which manifest 28 degrees of existence. So like from the Quran, we should reach from the letters to the letters of existence. إن صح التعبير.
Well, exactly. So we were talking earlier on about perfect numbers. So we've talked a little bit about 6 and the perfect man. The 28, these 28 letters are very significant for Ibn Arabi in terms of being the building blocks of all, let's say, sound. And since the whole universe is the sound of music, I was going to say, with a little hint of amusement. If that's what is actually being played the whole time, then you can see that the letters form a very, very important aspect of understanding the structure of things. So it's difficult for us because we tend to think of letters are just unimportant building blocks. Words matter. Words convey meaning. But for Ibn Arabi, letters also convey meaning. In fact, they convey more primary meaning than the words. And as an Arab, you can probably appreciate that better than an English person can, because in English, our conception of letters and words is quite different. So these letters, the science of the letters, he says, is the first science given to a saint. This is the first. Because they are the foundation of everything. So we can understand the principle. relatively well. We can probably also understand that when he says this is the domain of the knowledge of Jesus, we can understand why it should be like that. But the detail of it is something else, obviously. We don't necessarily understand more than one or two letters. We can understand, let us take an example, we can understand Aleph, stands upright, and it does not join to another letter. So clearly it is representing that aspect of the divine, which is always qa'im, let's say self-existent.
مستقل.
And also always it doesn't incline to one thing or another. Also, it doesn't join to anything. So it's a symbol of ahadiyya, of uniqueness. So things can join to it, but it doesn't join to anything else. So you can see that just in that small example, there is a huge symbolism going on of this letter and what it represents, and also the fact that it's the first of the, let's say, the extensions of the dot we were talking about. The first extension of a dot is to make a line, and that line is Aleph. So when that line moves in any way, it will produce other letters. So all the letters in that sense are forms of Aleph. But the Aleph itself stands. It's I think he calls it the qayyumiyya of the letters. It's sort of self-standing quality. So
it's all the idea of وحدة الوجود, all these different examples that you're mentioning, because they use this example of الصلصال or الطين. تستطيع أن تشكله بأشكال, different forms. You can make it all different kinds of forms and shapes, and you can draw through it. But it's one essence. So like the letter you were saying. So from this letter you can create all different kinds of letters.
Create all, yes, exactly. And from those letters and their combination, you create words. Carry meaning. And then we have a whole contemplation about where do these letters appear in our vocal tract. So do they come closer to the outer, or do they come from further down in the chest, more inner? So there's a whole, let's say, hierarchy and levels of existence are being discussed by Ibn Arabi. He's laid it all out. But as to whether human beings are yet capable quite of understanding what he's talking about, it's another matter entirely. I think his vision of things is so, first of all, universal, and second is detailed. That's very, very unusual combination. So on top of this, we'd have to say, how many people can actually read Ibn Arabi properly and understand what he's saying? Yes, we may have inklings, aspects. We may see, fantastic things, but how much of it has yet become general knowledge? Now, the reason I wanted to, because one thing I wanted to say is that so far we have understood Ibn Arabi as an Arab, as a Muslim, as a Sufi. These are all aspects of Ibn Arabi, for sure. But there is also a sense in which his universality has not yet manifested, because it can't manifest, like you were saying, at the level of there's this way or that way. So many people, for example, read Ghazali, and they benefit greatly, and they say, which one is better? Is Ghazali better than Ibn Arabi, or Ibn Arabi better than Ghazali? Or Mullah Sadra. Mullah Sadra better than Ibn Arabi because he came later and he explained more, or is Ibn Arabi better? So on and so on. All these kind of discussions are like, sort of on a historical story level of who's got the biggest understanding, which are often attempts by human beings to kind of understand what it is that these people were trying to convey and what, let's say, ma'rifah they really have. Which, of course, is very difficult when you don't have any ma'rifah yourself. It's difficult, rather difficult to understand. But for me, looking at it historically is, I would say, so far there have been many masters in different orders who have gone beyond being in an order. There are many, let's say, Mevlevi masters who went beyond being just Mevlevi. There are many Qadiri who went beyond being just Qadiri. They understood something about what it is to be a human being.
They became universal.
They became universal, exactly. But they were still within their tradition, and they explained themselves often in terms that people around them could understand. That doesn't mean that the structures that developed over time from the 13th century to now, or to, let's say, the 20th century, that those structures will stay in place. I think for myself, all the indications are that that time is coming to an end. We are at the beginning of a new era of understanding, a new era of humanity, a new era where we converse with each other and on what level we talk to each other. And it may be that within that context, Ibn Arabi takes a different, presents himself differently.
So, Doctor, you're talking about a universal personality of Ibn Arabi that should be discovered yet. So let us end here because you have an interesting ta'ammul in his name, Muhyiddin, and you have a story of that and how you discovered his name in your article, Reviving the Dead. So what does Muhyiddin means and why he is a Muhyiddin, and what does that relate, that have to relate with Ismullah al-Muhyi, or Jesus as a relation to Ismullah al-Muhyi, as a summary, if we end with this topic, the mystery of his name.
Well, the interesting thing is, of course, that as I mentioned there's an article which I've written, which you referred to, called Reviving the Dead, where I go into the name Muhyi and Muhyiddin, and how Ibn Arabi, most unusually, describes himself as Muhyiddin in a very elusive manner, and one that caused me great difficulty to understand. So there is a wonderful manuscript of his book Khiliyat al-Abdal, which we translated as the Four Pillars of Spiritual Transformation. And in the book, which appears to be in his own handwriting, and two predecessors who studied manuscripts both told me, yes, this is Ibn Arabi's handwriting. And my question was to them, well, there's something very odd at the beginning of this, because it begins apparently in the same hand, Qala, Sayyidina wa Imamuna, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. And I mean, I've never come across anybody who's talking about themselves like this. What are we, you serious? I mean, and they said, no, with Ibn Arabi, anything is possible. But they didn't answer my question.
He has two personalities, he has two manifestations.
Precisely. I understood much later on, after much puzzlement, really, trying to work it out. And various theories occurred to me as to what, maybe one of his students who had been very devoted had copied his handwriting very carefully. I thought, because he himself would never say that. He doesn't say it anywhere. Anyway, eventually...
You mentioned that you went there to Konya to make sure of the transcript. Also.
He even went to Konya to make sure on the manuscript itself. Was it written in the same hand as the text, yes, absolutely it was. There was no question about it. So then it dawned on me slowly, because we're often in these states very stupid, and it takes a long time for something to become clear, just how obvious it was. First of all, it was to do with the text itself, which is about the abdan. And a badal can be, for Ibn Arabi, in two places at the same time. He specifies it in the text. So Ibn Arabi, the scribe, this is a copy of the original, is writing about the author, Ibn Arabi, in these terms. And then he copies the text that the author had written down. And it was perfectly obvious. After that, it was just like, well, of course you would say that. And he would say it only in this particular text. Now, the reason it's to do with Muhyiddin is it's the only place I know of where in Ibn Arabi's handwriting, he basically calls himself Muhyiddin. Not, and I want to emphasize, he does not say it about himself. He says, I'm the scribe writing it about this author. So, author Ibn Arabi is Muhyiddin. Why does he make a big deal of this? Because the author wrote nothing except under divine inspiration. That's specified. So, when the scribe is making a copy, they are not in the same condition as the author. They are just the copyist.
Just as we understand when Hallaj and Bayezid al-Bastami أنا الحق وما في جبتي إلا الله وسبحانه ما أعظم شانه.
Exactly.
They're talking on لسان الله. So Allah هو الذي ينطق على لسانه.
Exactly. And so there is a difference. There is a distinction, which Ibn Arabi makes very plain. So that once that's clear, you say, okay, now let's find out, what does he mean by Muhyiddin? So one aspect of it is this copy was made of a text originally written in 599, but the copy is made in 602 Hijri. So beginning of the 7th century, there is a well-known hadith which Ghazali also mentions. Beginning of every century, I will send one to revive the religion. Fine. Now we understand the timing, but we still don't understand what does he really mean by it. And I think that's a matter of engagement with his writing on one side. For each of us, we will find out what he means to the extent that we accept such revivification, which means that in some sense we are ignorant, we are like the dead waiting to be revived by divine knowledge. And the more we understand that, then the more this process can begin of revivification. In the paper that I gave, I went through various aspects of this, relating it also to the fact of the role of Jesus in his writing, because of all the prophetic figures, you would say, the one who embodies muhyi more than anybody else is Jesus. In the blowing on the birds and giving life.
إني أخلق لكم من الطين كهيئة الطير فأنفخ فيه فيكون طيرا بإذن الله. مضمون الآية.
And so this giving life is through the breath. We already mentioned earlier that the breath of the Rahman comes from the Yemen. You can see this interweaving of the same principles, that in order for ihya to happen, there is something about breath and breathing out and blowing, just as we have been inspirated by the spirit, by the ruh. So also that process can be externalized and is externalized in the stories of Jesus, and both incidentally in the Christian tradition and in the Muslim.
So it's also about the birth. It's the birth of the new soul, or like the Quran says, فَلَنُحْيِيَنَّهُ حَيَاةً طَيِّبَةً, or اسْتَجِيبُوا لِلَّهِ وَلِلرَّسُولِ إِذَا دَعَاكُمْ لِمَا يُحْيِيكُمْ, or as the hadith that Jesus says, like لن يلج ملكوت السماوات من لم يلد مرتين. So there's always a talk about another birth, and then Ibn Arabi is the Muhyiddin, so he's the person that will make the salikin or musta'addin being born again, being born spiritually again.
Through knowledge. And that's what he specifies. It's a question of knowledge, direct knowledge. So yes, exactly. And this is the meaning of the second coming of Jesus also. But that's perhaps another story. But just to mention that what we see represented in the first coming of Jesus, with the breathing of Gabriel into Mary, is re-represented in the meaning of the second coming. Because in order for the second coming to happen, there has to be a community, let's say, of human beings able to understand what it means. Because he's not coming as a prophet. He is coming as a saint within the Muhammadian tradition. So that's another level. And one of the things I was reading very recently is Ibn Arabi's Kitab al-Isfar, the book of, it's translated in English as The Secrets of Voyaging. And in it he says, this is Ibn Arabi speaking in the 13th century, times now are not like times past. Now there is more unveiling, there is more spiritual knowledge than in the past. In the past, people did more practices. And then he has a very interesting line. He says, this will continue. This expansion of knowledge and divine unveiling and so on will continue until the descent of Jesus. So I think one has to understand that the descent of Jesus is the descent of the visibility, the making visible of this principle of muhyi, of reviving through knowledge. So in order for that to happen, there have to be people who understand what that means, who have, if you like, already been revived to some extent. And that seems to me to be the task of human beings nowadays, in spiritual terms. Not in material terms, a different matter. In spiritual terms, we are to be re-inspired with knowledge, proper knowledge.
So الحي هو الذي يدرك المعاني الحية أو المعاني التي تضج بالحياة. The dead will obviously understand nothing. And it's very interesting, Doctor, that nowadays, and as the hadith says, هناك سيأتي أفراد متعمقون في آخر الزمان يفهمون سورة التوحيد. And so it's interesting that we find today people like yourself and Professor James Morris or Professor William Chittick and other people, especially in the Western world, that are trying to delve in the mysteries and the great knowledge of Ibn Arabi and the Irfani tradition. It's an interesting thing.
Well, I think it also goes back to this idea of West and East. You have, as an Arab, you have a particular, you've been brought up in a tradition with a particular view of Ibn Arabi. But don't forget, Ibn Arabi was born in Spain. He was born in the West. He's a Maghribi. Therefore, there's something about why that happened, because he could have been born anywhere. If you think of the principle of Ibn Arabi, this muhyi principle, well, could have been in Uzbekistan. Why not? But it wasn't. It was in Spain, in Al-Andalus. So there's something, and he talks a little bit about it, about the imagery of the West. Shams al-Maghrib, for example, the sun which will rise in the West. So I'm not saying that this is anything necessarily to do with why Ibn Arabi's reception in the West is different, But it does, one aspect of it is simply that we don't have the cultural pre-understanding to get in the way. We come to it without understanding anything about it, probably, and we have to work hard because translating into English seems to be what has to happen. Because in the process of the translation, it's also an expansion of the original. It doesn't detract from the original, it's expanding the original.
Creating a new beauty that is originated from the original.
Yes, and making it accessible to people wherever they are. Because for whatever reason, God knows best, English has become the global language. And so that's a vehicle for this knowledge and inspiration to be brought out. Now, that doesn't detract from the Arabic at all, on the contrary. It just means that in fact, there's a new connection been made, let's say. Where
a certain level of manifestation of Ibn Arabi's thought that can be found in English. And also for an Arabic person, what can be found in English also can't be found in Arabic, so it's another blessing. And it's also about Ibn Arabi, Maraj al-Bahraini al-Taqiyan, so his suffer from the Andalus until he reached to Damascus, so he went all through from the west to the east.
Yeah, you probably know the famous vision that he had of his poetry, where an extraordinary creature that came out of his mouth, and its head extended to the east and to the west. And then he said, when I came back to myself, I realized that my words would reach the east and the west. So what did he mean by west and east? I mean, I don't think he meant, Islamic Maghrib and Mashriq. I think he just knew that this was for everybody. And I can't emphasize that enough, because we are all to some extent conditioned by our cultural perspective. So we unconsciously, mostly, as we start to think about it, we think, no, I'm not. I believe in the universality of humanity. Yes, I know that people have been to the moon and seen the whole Earth as one Earth. I know this, and I know it's a change in consciousness, but I'm still English. with all those sort of, perspectives. Well, I can be both, and that's the thing. We have multiple identities. We should be able to move seamlessly between one and another without getting confused.
In contrary, also, Jalaluddin Rumi, he traveled from the east to west, and he became also another universal personality, where now Ibn Arabi and Rumi are combined and connected, and one can be understood from the lens of the other.
Well, that was one of the great projects in Ottoman lands and Ottoman writers. There are many who used to interpret Rumi through the lens of Ibn Arabi, and Ibn Arabi through the lens of Rumi. So that was a definite understanding that with both, something new was born. And so I think with all these great ones, we should be thankful for their contribution to humanity, and work with it, make it work for us today in our world. We have desperate need of real understanding between a human being and their God, and the human being and the world, and the human being and other human beings. We have a great need for deep understanding and deep appreciation.
Thank you very much, Professor Stephen Hertzensson, for all this knowledge and insight that you shared. 2 hours of deep and interesting knowledge about Ibn Arabi and the Irfani tradition and ideas. And thank you very much.
You've been very kind, Hadi. Thank you for inviting me.